Good evening, fight fans. This is the Radulich and Broadcasting Network premier podcast, The History of Heavyweight Championship Boxing, where we take you through the years and the people, the champions, the titans, the athletes that brought you such great athletic contests in heavyweight boxing. We are looking at all the champions, from Muhammad Ali all the way down to the John Ruizes of the world. And John Ruiz is somebody we're actually going to talk about tonight, but I'll get to that in a moment.
Mark, we want people to listen. Don't scare them away with John Ruiz.
I am your host, the mandated reporter, and frankly, I'm mortified, Mr. Mark Radulich. And joining me, as he does each and every one of these shows to keep me on track, the punchy pugilist, the boxing historian, ladies and gentlemen, totally 80s, Pat Mullin. How do you do, sir?
Tonight's episode is sponsored by Lagunitas IPA.
Outstanding. Where we last left off, we were talking about Iron Mike Tyson and his ups and downs. And, of course, the next major heavyweight in the history of heavyweight championship boxing, as we mentioned in the previous episode, is the real deal, Evander Holyfield. But I have to warn you, dear listeners, that much like our Forgotten Sons episode, the history of Evander Holyfield can only be told by looking at the men he lost the title to multiple times, and the fracturing of said title by one of those people who now has a special place in hell for me. But yeah, this is going to be, this era, the Evander Holyfield era of boxing, the heavyweight scene is kind of a mess. We alluded to it in the Tyson episode because he's part of this too, but you can't tell Evander Holyfield's story, Pat, without looking at Riddick Bowe, Michael Moore, and the aforementioned John Ruiz. Now, you might be saying, but what about George Foreman and Lennox Lewis? They're going to get their own separate episodes, so we're not going to spend too much time on them. But we are going to talk for a little bit about the three aforementioned men because, again, you can't tell Evander Holyfield's story without talking about those three people.
But we'll underscore that this is an episode geared towards the career of Evander Holyfield. And while those guys are all important parts of the career of Evander, there are more pieces of the puzzle than the entire picture.
And they certainly add to the mess that was the heavyweight title scene. Just fractures upon fractures upon fractures. All right. Evander Holyfield was born October 19, 1962 in the mill town of Atmore, Alabama. The youngest of 9 children, Holyfield was much younger than his other siblings and was born from a different father. Holyfield's family later moved to Hotlanta, Georgia, where he was raised in the crime-ridden Bowen Homes housing projects. He began boxing at age 7 and won the Boys Club boxing tournament. At 13, he qualified to compete in his first Junior Olympics. By age 15, Holyfield became the Southeastern Regional Champion, winning this tournament and the Best Boxer Award. By 1984, he had a record of 160 wins and 14 losses, with 76 by knockout. When he was 20 years old, Holyfield represented the U.S. in the 1983 Pan American Games in Caracas, Venezuela, where he won a silver medal after losing to Cuban world champion Pablo Romero. The following year, he was the National Golden Gloves champion and won a bronze medal in the 84 Summer Olympic Games in Los Angeles, California, after a controversial disqualification in the second round of the semifinal against New Zealand's Kevin Barry. Holyfield started out professionally as a light heavyweight with a televised win in 6 rounds over Lionel Bjarem at Madison Square Garden on November 15th, 1984. January 20th, 85, he won another 6-round decision over Eric Winbush in Atlantic City, New Jersey. On March 13th, he knocked out Fred Brown in the first round in Norfolk, Virginia, and on April 20th, he knocked out Mark Rivera in 2 rounds in Corpus Christi, Texas. Both he and his next opponent, Tyrone Booz, both moved up to the Cruiserweight division for their fight on July 20th, 1985 in Norfolk, Virginia. Holyfield won an 8-round decision over Booz. He then went on to knock out Rick Myers in the first round on August 29th in his hometown of Atlanta. On October 30th in Atlantic City, Holyfield knocked out opponent Jeff Meacham in 5 rounds, and his last fight for 1985 was against Anthony Davis on December 21st in Virginia Beach, Virginia. He won by knocking out Davis in the 4th round. He began 1986 with a knockout in 3 rounds over former World Cruiserweight challenger Cassandra Moody, and proceeded to beat Jesse Shelby and Terry Mims before being given a world title try by the WBA Cruiserweight champion Dwight Muhammad Qawi. In what was called by the Ring as the best cruiserweight bout of the 1980s, Holyfield became world champion by defeating Qawi by a narrow 15-round split decision. He culminated in 1986 with a trip to Paris, France, where he beat Mike Brothers by a knockout in 3 in a non-title bout. In 1987, he defended his title against former Olympic teammate and gold medal winner Henry Tillman, who had beaten Mike Tyson twice as an amateur. He retained his belt, winning by 7th-round knockout, and then went on to unify his WBA belt with the IBF belt held by Ricky Parkey, knocking Parkey out in 3 rounds. For his next bout, he returned to France, where he retained the title with an 11-round knockout against former world champion Ozzy Ocasio. In his last fight of 1987, he offered Muhammad Qawi a rematch, and this time he beat Qawi by a knockout in only 4 rounds. By 1988, he was having another productive year. He started by becoming the first universally recognized World Cruiserweight champion after defeating the lineal and WBC champion Carlos de Leon in Las Vegas. The fight was stopped after 8 rounds. And so this is where the plot thickens. After that fight, he announced he was moving up in weight to pursue the World Heavyweight Championship held by Mike Tyson at that time. His first fight as a heavyweight took place on July 16th when he beat former Tyson rival James Quick Tillis by a knockout in 5 in Lake Tahoe, Nevada. For his third and final bout of 1988, he beat former heavyweight champion Pinklin Thomas, who you'll recall from our previous podcast, also by knockout in 7 rounds. Holyfield began 89, meeting former heavyweight champion Michael Dokes. This fight was named one of the best fights of the 1980s by Ring Magazine as best heavyweight bout of the 1980s. Holyfield won by a knockout in the 10th round, and then he met Brazilian champion Adilson Rodriguez, who lasted 2 rounds. His last fight of the 80s was against Alex Stewart, a hard-punching fringe contender. Stewart shocked Holyfield early with quick, hard punches, but eventually fell in 8. In 1990, Holyfield beat Seamus McDonough, knocking him out in 4 rounds. By this time, Holyfield had been Ring Magazine's #1 contender for 2 years and had yet to receive a shot at Tyson's heavyweight title. And as we all know what happened next. He was supposed to face Tyson, but Tyson decided to take a tune-up fight of sorts in Tokyo, Japan, against the infamous Buster Douglas. And we all know what happened from our previous podcast, and, because this is a famous fight in history, Mike Tyson lost his Undisputed Heavyweight Championship to Buster Douglas. So, quick do-si-do, and Buster Douglas's first heavyweight title defense was against our man, the real deal, Evander Holyfield. They met on October 25th, 1990, but Douglas came into the fight 246 pounds and offered little in the fight against Holyfield, who was in ideal shape at a lean 208 pounds. In the 3rd round, Douglas tried to start a combination with a big right uppercut. Holyfield countered with a straight right hand, and Douglas went down for the count. Holyfield was the new undisputed heavyweight champion of the world. At the time of the knockout, Holyfield was ahead on all 3 judges' scorecards, all seeing it 20-18 for Holyfield. Pat, any thoughts about, there's not a whole lot you can say, but I want to let you weigh in here. Is there an alternate universe where Buster Douglas beats Evander Holyfield, or was this sort of written in the stars that even with the hiccup that was Buster Douglas, it was always going to be Tyson and Holyfield at some point?
There was always going to be Tyson Holyfield. It's just what it was going to be. Even the very best Buster Douglas, like the guy we saw against Mike Tyson, I don't think he has a good night against this version of Evander Holyfield that showed up. You talked about Holyfield having made his professional debut as a light heavyweight and moving up to cruiserweight and unifying that division before moving up to heavyweight. The cruiserweight weight limit at the time when Evander Holyfield was in the division was 185 pounds. And so for Holyfield to move up, you mentioned Douglas's weight of 246, which was grossly out of shape for him, but not uncommon for guys to be going up to the mark of 230 pounds, 235 pounds. And Holyfield was moving up to fight these guys and giving away a tremendous amount of natural size. And so one of the things you and I had talked about off air was Holyfield's conditioning program that he used to try to become a legitimate heavyweight. And what he did was he consulted Lee Haney, who was at the time, an 8-time Mr. Olympia winner. And aside from Haney, in order to build body mass, what Holyfield did was he trained with Fred Hatfield, who was a world-renowned powerlifter. And what they did was they modified a lot of Holyfield's training by having him do a lot more weight work, which was very taboo for boxers, and in many ways still is. They had him do a lot of what they thought was more functional type of training for someone trying to put on mass while decreasing body fat. And so Holyfield, in a lot of ways, changed how many boxers trained. And for, a certain period of time, it was very, very effective for the game he employed, because you were seeing short bursts of a lot of energy meant to kind of reestablish themselves repeatedly over a long period of time. What we saw in the Douglas fight was Holyfield in much better physical condition, Douglas out of shape, and reactionary time was markedly different between the two, which is how Holyfield was able to counter one Douglas uppercut with a beautiful straight right hand and score a one-punch knockout against a guy who had taken Mike Tyson's best shots and gotten up from them. And again, I don't think anybody's ever going to dispute that Tyson was a much harder one-punch guy, especially early in a fight, than Evander Holyfield was as a heavyweight.
Absolutely. Holyfield would make 3 defenses of his belt before he starts to run into trouble. He first wins a unanimous decision against the returning George Foreman. George Foreman, by this point, had made his comeback after walking away from the sport for about a decade. We'll talk about him in a future chapter. Evander Holyfield, again, wins a unanimous decision on April 19th, 1991 at the Convention Hall in Atlantic City. He'll then go on to face Burt Cooper and win a TKO victory in 7 rounds out of 12 on November 23rd, 1991 at the Omni in Atlanta, Georgia. And then finally, because Larry Holmes fought 900 people throughout his years and fought everybody, Evander Holyfield won a unanimous decision against the Hall of Famer Larry Holmes on June 19th, 1992 at Caesars Palace in Paradise, Nevada. However, he would run into the undefeated future heavyweight champion, Riddick Bowe, on November 13th, 1992, and he would lose a unanimous decision to Mr. Bowe, and those two will go on to have a storied trilogy of fights. But let's take a moment and learn who Riddick Bowe was. Who is this man that would unseat the undisputed, undefeated heavyweight champion of the world? Bowe was born on August 10th, 1967, the 12th of his mother, Dorothy Bowe's 13 children. Bowe was born and raised in the Brownsville section of Brooklyn, New York City. Hey, Pat, remind the people what kind of area Brownsville is.
It rhymes with spithole if you replace the P with another letter.
His brother Henry died of AIDS, and his sister Brenda was stabbed to death by a drug addict during an attempted robbery. Brownsville, everybody. Bowe was in the same elementary school 6th grade class with former heavyweight champion Mike Tyson. He says, "We went to school together in the 6th grade in PS 396, which was in Brownsville." Bowe was training at the Bedford-Stuyvesant Boxing Association gym for as an amateur. Bowe won the prestigious New York Golden Gloves Championship and other tournaments. In 1984, at age 17, he knocked out opponent James Smith in just 4 seconds. In 1985, at the National Golden Gloves Championships, he lost to Fort Worth heavyweight Donald Stevens. Apart from boxing, he attended Kingsborough Community College, where he studied drama, of all things, in hopes of an acting career after boxing. He also took up a business administration study. Bo won 4 New York Golden Gloves championships. He was a light heavyweight runner-up for the 1986 World Championships and 1986 Goodwill Games. Bo won the silver medal in the 1988 Seoul Olympics, outpointing Soviet Alex Miroshnikenko.
Yeah, close enough.
Miro, the Bulgarian brute, in the semifinals, and losing a controversial match in the finals to future world heavyweight champion Lennox Lewis, who we will talk about on a future podcast. Bo turned professional in March of 1989 and knocked out Lionel Butler. His then manager, Rock Newman, it's amazing.
Boy, if anybody deserves a show, Rock Newman does.
You ain't just whistling Dixie. Kept Bo active, fighting 13 times in 1989, beating journeymen, the most notable being Gary Lane, whom he beat twice. In September 1990, Bo made his first step up in class, fighting faded ex-champion Pinklin Thomas, who also fought everybody in this decade, whom he dominated until Thomas gave up after 8 rounds. The following month, Bo knocked out Bert Cooper in 2 rounds, which added to his reputation and high ranking. In March of 1991, Bo knocked out 1984 Olympic super heavyweight gold medalist Tyrell Biggs. In Bo's next fight, ex-champion Tony Tubbs appeared to outbox and outsmart Bo in a close bout, only to have the judges award Bo a unanimous decision. In August of 91, Bo knocked out future world heavyweight champion Bruce Seldon in 1 round. In July of 1992, he knocked out South African Pierre Coetzer in the 7th round of a world title eliminator. In November of 1992, he fought reigning champ Evander Holyfield, as I said before, for the Undisputed heavyweight title. Which, at the time, Bo was 31-0 going into this fight, which he, as I said before, won in a unanimous decision. He floored Holyfield in the 11th round. However, and this marks noting, it was the 10th round most boxing fans will remember. The epic, brutal back-and-forth exchanges helped make it Ring Magazine's Round of the Year. Commentator Al Bernstein exclaimed, "That was one of the greatest rounds in heavyweight history, period." Lay it on me, Pat. Bo Holyfield won. What are the finer points?
One of, in my opinion, the 5 best heavyweight championship fights of all time. You have this champion who has fought for respect in the shadow of Mike Tyson, who has beaten ex-champions who deserve the shots they got, beat the reigning champion who beat the man. And you have this other guy who is trained by the guru of great heavyweights, Eddie Futch, who trained Joe Frazier, Ken Norton, and so many others at such a high level, or Larry Holmes. And he said of Bo that Bo had more natural talent than any of them and the potential to be the very best. And what you saw was each of these guys at the peak of their powers going in there to fight, and this 10th round showed what each guy did best. Bo with a dominant jab, great right hand on the outside, and maybe the best uppercut of anybody I've ever seen on the inside, really worked over Holyfield and hurt him. And you think Holyfield just all but out at this point against the guy who's bigger, younger, stronger, faster. But Holyfield showed the biggest attribute of his career, and that's a championship heart, and just refused to go down, refused to not fight back, and rallies at the end of this round like only a great champion can to hurt Bo, who seemingly has every physical advantage against him. You're just trying to figure out how Holyfield can do anything, and there he goes roaring back. And one of the greatest, not just heavyweight fights of all time, but one of the greatest fights of all time.
You know, the next thing that's going to happen, I think, really tarnishes Bo's legacy. I want to see the parallel universe where what I'm going to talk about next doesn't happen. But as we said, Riddick Bowe now wins the Undisputed Unified Heavyweight Championship of the world. He is the WBA, the WBC, the IBF, and Lineal Heavyweight Champion. And here's what happened next. A couple of weeks earlier in London, Bowe's old Olympic rival Lennox Lewis knocked out Canadian Donovan Razor Ruddock, who you've heard us talk about, in 2 rounds, establishing himself as the WBC's _1 contender. The Bowe, Holyfield, and Lewis Ruddock fights were part of a mini-tournament whereby all 4 fighters agreed that the 2 winners would meet each other for the Undisputed World Heavyweight Championship. It all looked so good on paper. Bowe's manager, Rock Newman, made a proposal. The $32 million purse HBO was offering should be split 90-10 in Bowe's favor. An absurd offer which Lennox Lewis rejected. Well, of course he did. Lewis's manager, Kelly Maloney...
No, that's Frank Maloney.
Known as Frank Maloney at the time.
Yeah, it's still Frank Maloney, regardless of what he thinks. He thinks.
Yes, sir. Rejected another offer of $2 million for Lewis to fight on a Bowe undercard, citing his distrust of the Bowe camp after the aforementioned financial negotiations. And in a move straight out of pro wrestling, Bowe responded by holding a press conference in which he dumped the WBC World Heavyweight Championship belt into a trash can and relinquished it in order to protest the actions of the WBC and WB President Jose Sulaiman concerning the fight payoff. Yeah, just to be clear, he had a literal trash can at this thing, and he told Lennox Lewis, he threw the belt in the trash, and he told Lennox Lewis, if Lennox Lewis wants this belt, he can dig through the trash and get it, and then he'll be a garbage picker. Because Riddick Bowe apparently had the mind of a 5-year-old. This fractures the title. And just so people understand how frustrating this is for me as a fan, the title won't get reunified again until Lennox Lewis does it years later. And after Lennox does it, it won't happen again.
Nope, still hasn't happened.
Still hasn't happened. So I don't know what would have happened had they actually fought and kept the titles together. But yeah, Riddick Bowe caused a fracture in the heavyweight championship of the world that won't be fixed until many years later, and then again will fracture and will never get fixed. And it may never. And even the guys who have the belts right now, who are planning to fight each other, may not unify them. So, boxing, hell of a sport. Anyway, Bowe's first defense of his remaining titles, the WBA and the IBF, came on February 6, 1993, when he fought 34-year-old former champion Michael Dokes at Madison Square Garden, and he knocked him out in the first round. Poor Michael Dokes. In Bowe's next fight, on May 22, 1993, at the RFK Stadium in D.C., Bowe knocked out Jesse Ferguson in the second round to retain the title. Now, again, we have controversy. Only 3 months prior, on the undercard of Bowe versus Dokes, Ray Mercer, who was scheduled to be Bowe's next opponent, met Jesse Ferguson in what was supposed to be a tune-up before his championship match with Bowe. Instead, Ferguson controlled almost the entire fight and earned the upset victory by unanimous decision, knocking Mercer out of contention. With Bowe now in need of a new opponent, it was announced on March 24th that it would be Ferguson who would next challenge Bowe. However, and this is an ongoing theme in this era of boxing, as Ferguson was not ranked by the IBF, the organization chose not to sanction the bout. Thus, Bowe's IBF heavyweight title was not on the line.
Yeah, and Jesse Ferguson got that shot because he outpointed Ray Mercer, who was being lined up to fight Bowe at the time. And Ray Mercer, who is a contender of the 90s, has a habit of choking in big fights because, as we talked about, Evander Holyfield defended the championship against Larry Holmes. Larry Holmes was not meant to get that shot. Larry Holmes got that shot by virtue of beating Ray Mercer in a huge upset at the time. So Mercer rebounds, gets a couple fights, and then after he fights Jesse Ferguson for a tune-up, he's supposed to fight Bowe. Well, of course, in that fight, Ray Mercer chokes and loses a lopsided decision to Jesse Ferguson. And so at that point, the thought is, well, we'll give Ferguson the shot. But because Ferguson is so, lowly thought of in terms of the sanctioning bodies and people as a whole, most people are looking at that fight as a farce. Like, they don't want to see it. But they're going to give him the shot because he did beat the guy who was supposed to get the shot. And it was about as competitive as you think it would be between Bo and Ferguson.
Well, meanwhile, Evander Holyfield did not go into the woods to live deliberately. He was getting back on the winning track, preparing to regain his titles.
He started with a new trainer.
Yes, sir. He started with Alex Stewart, whom he beat in a unanimous decision on June 26, 1993, in Convention Hall, Atlantic City. He would then have his second match with Riddick Bowe on November 6, 1993, at Caesar's Palace. And this time around, Evander Holyfield would regain the WBA and IBF heavyweight titles in a majority decision. And this is the one blemish on an otherwise distinguished and undefeated career for one Riddick Bowe. The only loss on Bowe's storied career was the second match against Evander Holyfield. Now, Pat, this fight lives in infamy. This is the infamous Fan Man incident. But before I get into this idiot that parachuted into the ring, tell us about Riddick Bowe, Evander Holyfield 2, Electric Boogaloo.
So, like we talked about, Holyfield took on some tough opposition before he took this fight. Alex Stewart, while never really emerging above that contender level, was a very good fighter at that time. We actually shared a trainer by the name of Edwin Viruet, who was formerly a lightweight contender in the 70s. And Alex was known at the time as a guy who knocked out the guys he beat, but just couldn't cross that line over to the top. He had fought Mike Tyson in a fight where he admittedly went out cold and got caught cold in the first round and didn't finish it. And he's most notable for losing those big fights to guys like Tyson, Holyfield, Foreman, etc. But he was a tough guy who gave Evander a real hard fight because what they wanted to do was put Holyfield in with a real puncher, and that's what he got. And again, while he won the Stewart fight, and it was impressive that he won it, that was not an easy one because this is a guy who he had seen before, who had hurt him before, and they wanted him to overcome that. So it was very smart psychologically to have him do that in preparing for a rematch with Bowe. In addition, he hired a new trainer for the entirety of his pro career. He had worked with the great George Benton and Lou Duva, training him and preparing him. But in this fight, he trained with Emmanuel Stewart of Kronk, who is notable for training Thomas Hearns and many, many other, world champions, and of course became an HBO analyst later on. But Manny really had Evander work on a lot of different things than Duva and Georgie did, and changed his programming and really wanted him more active, more on his toes, more boxing than trying to get inside and match power with a big man. Bowe, at this point, is on top of the world because he's the heavyweight champion, but we talk about the opposition he faced in response to that. A very faded, drug-addled Michael Dokes in a showcase defense in his hometown, and the non-plaused Jesse Ferguson, who nobody thought had a chance, and sure enough, he proved everyone right with that. And Bowe is in the press a lot for how he's handling himself and his eating habits. He's often being photographed at McDonald's and, doing things that aren't necessarily great for him. He comes into this fight heavier than he did in the previous fight by a significant amount. And he proceeds to not put on one of his better performances. Whereas Holyfield, even though Bowe fights well, Holyfield really surges and takes the lead and really did everything he could to just get that belt back and prove that not only was he on the level of Bowe, but he might even be better, and people had given up on him too fast.
What's memorable about this fight for me is how many times the two of them hit each other after the bell.
They went after it. And you can say, oh, there were cheap shots. It wasn't necessarily that they were trying to fight dirty. It's just this is one of those rivalries where there's such one-upsmanship between them that neither guy was willing to bend and let the other guy have the last one. Like, we remember Emmanuel Stewart literally tackling Holyfield at the end of a round when they got into it to stop him from doing anything crazy.
Yeah, this was a high-intensity, emotional fight, just watching it earlier today. If you had to narrow down, like, the 5 most entertaining, emotion-filled fights in the history of heavyweight boxing, this has got to be up there. I mean, this was incredible.
Just the way they fought, the intensity. Even though to me it's not as good as the first fight, it's still a great fight.
They fought like they hated each other.
Even marred by the idiot with the parachute. And even with Bo not being in optimal condition, the way we saw him, they really still go at it tooth and nail, and you can tell both guys are fighting for everything.
Yeah. Like I said, they fought like they hated each other, and I don't know like what the personal relationship was between the two of them, but they, you think about like Anthony Joshua versus Andy Ruiz the second time around, and Andy Ruiz was out of shape in that one, but Anthony Joshua did not fight like a man possessed. He jabbed in a circle for 12 rounds, and Andy Ruiz, just not a good enough boxer to keep up with him, to the point where at the end he threw a tantrum and demanded that Anthony Joshua meet him in the middle of the ring, and Anthony Joshua laughed at him, and that was the end of that. This was, and it wasn't like a Paul Nate Robinson kind of a thing. These two were obviously high caliber boxers, but they fought with such rage and emotion. It was an incredible thing to watch. The Fan Man incident, and as we talked about earlier, parachutist James Fan Man Miller would crash into the ring during the second minute of round 7, causing a 21-minute delay of that fight. Miller was immediately pulled from the ropes into the crowd by security. He was attacked by both fans and security, eventually being knocked unconscious by a member of both security team. And after a short hospital stay, Miller was taken to the Clark County Detention Center and charged with dangerous flying, being released after paying $200 bail. And the Fan Man incident was named Event of the Year by Ring Magazine. Pat, has anyone ever asked this man what was the point of all of this? Like, what was his intention? Did he want to have a conversation with Evander Holyfield? I mean, what? Was he just a lunatic, or did he like what was he trying to accomplish here? Do we know?
I don't think anybody's ever gotten a straight answer on that. Now he's dead, so we can't really figure it out.
Okay. What a dope. Anyway, Evander Holyfield's reign as heavyweight champion, again, will not go very long at all. As a matter of fact, he will lose the WBA and IBF heavyweight titles to Michael Moorer in a majority decision on April 22nd, 1994, at Caesars Palace in Nevada. And now Michael Moorer is in this pantheon of heavyweight champions, so let's talk about Michael Moorer. He was born November 12, 1967, in Brooklyn, and raised in the small town of
Manassas,
Pennsylvania. From an early age, Moorer began playing football and was raised by a single mother who noticed Moorer's unusual hyperactivity. At age 10, Moorer's grandfather, a former New York Golden Gloves champion who sparred with greats such as Archie Moore, encouraged Moorer to begin training at age 11. Moorer is naturally right-handed, but fought the entirety of his career as a southpaw. Moorer graduated from Manassas High School in 1987, where he starred in football as a linebacker and tight end. As his amateur career developed, Moorer moved to Detroit, Michigan to train with the legendary Emanuel Stewart. In 1986, Moorer was a national champion for the 156-pound, which was light middleweight at the time, weight class. At Stewart's Kronk Gym, Moorer was known for beating professionals while still an amateur. Moorer also won a bronze medal at the Goodwill Games and finished his amateur career with a record of 48-16. Moore had a fast rise through the professional boxing ranks at light heavyweight. He debuted on March 4th, 1988, knocking out Adrian Riggs in the first round. Before the year's end, he was undefeated in 11 bouts, winning all by the way of early round knockouts, and fighting for the world title for the first time.
And also trained by, at the time, Emmanuel Stewart.
He acquired the newly created WBO light heavyweight title with a 5-round knockout of Ramsey Hassan. In 1989, he retained the title 6 times, beating Freddie Delgado, Frankie Schwindel, Mike Cedillo, and former WBA champion Leslie Stewart, among others. In 1990, he retained the title 3 times for the end of the year, beating Mario Mello and former Michael Spinks challenger Jim McDonald, among others. And then he moved up to heavyweight in 1991. He rolled through the competition en route to securing an opportunity to fight for the vacant WBO heavyweight championship the following year against Burt Cooper. Moore stopped Cooper in the 5th round after both fighters were down, hurt during the bout.
Boy, that's a fight to watch if you've never seen it, folks. Michael Moore and Burt Cooper had a good old-fashioned roadhouse slugfest.
I will put that on the list. He did not defend the lesser-regarded WBO heavyweight belt, because this is becoming a thing, by the way. Fracturing titles, being stripped of titles, vacating titles, you know.
To be fair, the WBO title at that time meant about as much as, what you leave in the toilet.
Fair enough. On April 22nd, 1994, Moore challenged Evander Holyfield for the lineal IBF and WBA title belts. In round 2, Holyfield sent Moore down on the canvas, but Moore overcame and went on to win a majority decision, as I said before. As a result, he became the first ever Southpaw heavyweight champion. All right, Pat, real quick, talk to me about how in the hell Evander Holyfield lost the title to Michael Moore.
So, we go to that conditioning regime that we talked about that Holyfield used to become a heavyweight. And, he worked with a bodybuilder in Lee Haney and a power lifter in Fred Hatfield. And, they talk about how, oh, no, you use weights and do this stuff. There's a reason people eschew weightlifting in terms of fighting. It leads a lot of times to excess muscle mass that tires you out more quickly. It leads to muscle tears often and muscle trauma that you don't often get in standard fight training. And if you watch the Holyfield who fought Michael Moore, this is a guy who doesn't throw a tremendous amount of punches, is usually outworked by a small to immediate margin in majority of the rounds of the fight. And even in the round that he knocked Moore down for the fight's only knockdown, it was one of only 5 punches he landed in the round, whereas Moore landed 20. So if I'm watching that fight and scoring it as a judge, you have to take away a point from Moore for getting knocked down, but I score that round a 10-9 round as opposed to a standard 10-8 round. And Moore at the time is also working with the venerable Teddy Atlas, who does everything he can in that corner to motivate Michael, to wake him up, to tell him this is a close fight and this is for the heavyweight championship of the world. And Holyfield is kind of lost and meandering and searching for an answer, where at this point in time Holyfield's also working with a different trainer after parting with Emmanuel Stewart. So there's a lot of pieces to this puzzle, and Holyfield just doesn't work enough against Moore, who's a good fighter, but as a heavyweight, he's not a great fighter. He just happens to work harder than Holyfield in this fight. And it pays off because by a very close margin, a majority decision, that means within a point or two, it can go either way. He wins. And what this leads to is the thought that Holyfield has some sort of health issue with his heart. There's all kinds of talk about he needs to retire and things of that nature, a lot of which are blown out of proportion, which we'll get to.
Yes. Well, in Michael Moore's first defense of those belts on November 5th, 1994, Moore faced 45-year-old George Foreman, who lost his last fight for the vacant WBO heavyweight title to Tommy Morrison. Good old Tommy Gunn. For 9 rounds, Moore easily outboxed him, hitting and moving away while Foreman moving forward, seemingly unable to pull the trigger on his punches. Moore was ahead on all 3 judges' scorecards entering the 10th round when Foreman hit him with a number of long-range jabs. Then suddenly a short right hand caught Moore on the tip of his chin, gashing open his bottom lip, and he collapsed to the canvas. Moore was knocked out and lost the World Championship. He lost his undefeated record. Foreman, at the age of 45, became the oldest fighter ever to win the World Heavyweight title, and we will talk more about that at length in a future podcast. The following year, Moore regrouped by winning against fringe contender Melvin Foster. Next, the WBA demanded that Foreman fight their number 1 challenger, who at the time was the competent but aging Tony Tucker. And for reasons not clearly known, Foreman refused to fight Tucker and allowed the WBA to strip him of that belt. However, Foreman retained the IBF title with a close and controversial decision against German fighter Axel Schulz. Because of the controversial nature of the Foreman-Schulz bout, the IBF ordered Foreman to travel to Germany for a rematch, but Foreman refused, choosing to leave the IBF belt vacant instead. South African Francois Botha traveled to Germany instead and beat Schulz with another close decision to claim the title, but he was stripped of it when he tested positive for illegal substances shortly after. At which point Moore was given the opportunity to fight Schulz for the vacant crown in Berlin. On June 22, 1996, Moore won the IBF heavyweight crown once again, beating Schulz by a 12-round split decision. And that is where we will leave Moore's story. If you're curious, he goes on to lose, unfortunately, to David Tua, Eliseo Castillo, and he ends his career February 8th, 2008 in Dubai with a record of 52 wins and 4 losses. So that is our story there with good old Michael Moore. Meanwhile, Tyson, as we talked about, had recovered the WBC and WBA heavyweight championship, and after being stripped of the WBC title for not facing Lennox Lewis, he defended the WBA title against Holyfield on November 9th of 1996, and, of course, Evander Holyfield TKO'd Mike Tyson in the 11th round.
But only through the healing powers of Benny Hinn.
At the MGM Grand in Paradise, Nevada. They would, of course, have a rematch, which we talked about in our previous podcast. And that's the bite fight. We don't need to get into that again.
But Holyfield's story prior to Tyson is interesting in that we talk about how there was the thought process of his heart being malfunctioning or whatever, and all these health issues, and he went and got evaluated by doctors at the Mayo Clinic, and he saw Benny Hinn, who laid hands on him, as Holyfield was a pronounced Christian, and all these things resulted in a groundswell of public well-wishing sentiment toward Evander's health, and when he announced the comeback, the thought process wasn't, oh great, he's back. It's, oh no, I don't want to see him get hurt. He was such a great champion. I don't want to see this end poorly. So he took a comeback fight with Ray Mercer, and he looked good in that fight against a tough opponent, was the first guy to ever drop Ray Mercer, and then he fights our friend Riddick Bowe in a third fight. And while he starts very strong, he runs out of gas, gets hurt, and gets knocked out. And then again, people are crying for him to retire. It's not there, etc. And he refuses, as usual, and gets sent eventually to be the lamb to the slaughter to Mike Tyson, but turns that on its head by knocking out Mike, like we talked about in the last episode. And, of course, the bite fight follows.
Yeah. I did forget this note about Michael Moore. He will defend his titles against Michael Moore on November 8th, 1997 at the Thomas & Mack Center in Paradise, Nevada, where he retains the WBA heavyweight title and wins the IBF title from Mr. Moore.
Done hurts Michael Moore or something fierce, knocks him down 5 times.
retired him in the 8th of 12 rounds. He'll go on to retain the WBA and IBF titles on September 19th, 1998 at the George Dome against Vaughn Bean.
The venerable Vaughn Bean.
And then he faces in yet another rivalry, and we are nearing the end of the Evander Holyfield saga. He meets...
We wish we were nearing the end of it.
He meets Lennox Lewis for the WBA and IBF title and the WBC title. So here we have an opportunity to reunify the titles again. And because the gods hate us, the boxing gods, they go to a draw on March 13th, 1999 at Madison Square Garden. Pat, Lennox Lewis, Evander Holyfield won. A draw. But for why?
Because two people at ringside didn't watch the fight. That's really the best way to say it. There was a lot of media coverage for this. This was one of the few fights at the time that was getting real mainstream attention. And Evander Holyfield, because of his juice from the Mike Tyson fight, was really the public favorite, whereas the boxing fandom and the boxing world really believed Lennox Lewis was the best heavyweight at the time. And what happened and what we saw in this fight was a Holyfield who couldn't pull the trigger, couldn't get in close, and was kept at distance by Lewis's jab and right hand for 9 to 10 of the 12 rounds that we saw. And Holyfield just couldn't get off. It wasn't there. And really, this fight is the beginning of people seeing that at 36 years old, Evander is not in his prime anymore and doesn't look like he's at that top level that he needs to be competitive with the best heavyweights in the world. And there were hints of that against Vaughn Bean, and no disrespect to Vaughn Bean, but that's a guy who shouldn't be competing well against the heavyweight champion of the world, but did in multiple rounds. And Lewis, meanwhile, is going out and fighting the tougher guys available, like Oliver McCall, like Shannon Briggs, Ray Mercer. And Holyfield just looked terrible in this fight. Lewis, for the most part, to everybody watching, clearly won, but didn't get the decision. And there was probably a political agenda at play in that, because we got a rematch, of course, just a few months later in November.
Right. And this is where Lennox Lewis puts on his glove and unites and unifies all the belts, and then snaps and half the people in the universe disappear. No, just kidding. But yes, he does fight Lennox Lewis again on November 13th, 1999 at the Thomas and Mack Center, where Lennox Lewis will unify the WBA and IBF titles, which he just took from Evander Holyfield, and he will unify them with his WBC and the vacant IBO heavyweight title. The IBO, Pat, 50 words or less. I'm sure you'll give me only 10 words, but what do people need to know about the IBO?
Nothing.
Terrific. Moving on. After Lewis defeated Holyfield, the WBA ordered Lewis to defend the title against John Ruiz of Puerto Rico, who was then an obscure Don King fighter who had been made the WBA's number one ranked contender. The WBA gave permission for Lewis to fight his WBC mandatory Michael Grant first if he would fight Ruiz next, to which Lewis agreed. Opposed to this, King challenged this decision in court on the basis of a clause in the Lewis-Holyfield rematch contract that said Lewis's first bout as undisputed champion would be against the WBA's number one contender. Lewis was therefore stripped, tell me if you've heard this one before, of his WBA belt if he fought Grant first. It was because of this that the WBA instated its Super Champion title, giving unified title holders who also hold a WBA belt more time to defend against mandatory challengers. And this is where we need to talk about John Ruiz. So now the WBA title is going to be contested between John Ruiz and Evander Holyfield. Who the hell is John Ruiz? John Ruiz was born January 4th, 1972, the aforementioned Puerto Rican descent, and is the first Latino boxer to win a world heavyweight title. John Ruiz will win... John Ruiz... Lost my notes here. Sorry.
Evander Holyfield will beat John Ruiz to be the first guy in history to lay claim to 4 separate reigns as a heavyweight champion by beating him very controversially in the summer of 2000 in a decision where a lot of people felt that Ruiz had shockingly, despite his very suspect record, done enough to beat Holyfield, who, even though he didn't look great against Lennox Lewis, was still thought to be in a class well above where John Ruiz was. For my money, and this is one of the fights I had to rewatch for this as much as I may not have wanted to, because it's not a particularly thrilling fight. I still think Evander Holyfield did enough to win this fight. He had Ruiz hurt at various points. He actually dropped Ruiz with a body shot that was ruled a low blow, and Ruiz milked all of it. And a lot of what Ruiz does in this fight is what you'll see from him throughout his run as WBA heavyweight champion and or mandatory challenger, where he got the nicknames of things like jab and grab, the Greco-Roman heavyweight boxing champion, because John's style was very much not fan-friendly. John had a habit of jabbing and then grabbing onto whatever was in front of him, just holding repeatedly, clinching, pretending there were low blows involved, really stuff that nobody would pay to see. And it was very disappointing as a fan to have to see that. It was disappointing to see Holyfield have such a difficult time with that. And it was disappointing that this went on for 3 fights between them.
Yeah, thank you for throwing me a lifeline there. I got a little mixed up. Back on track. So, Evander Holyfield, as we just mentioned, beats John Ruiz the first time and wins the vacant WBA heavyweight title. They'll have a rematch on March 3rd, 2001 at the Mandalay Bay Event Center in Paradise, Nevada. And Evander Holyfield will lose the WBA heavyweight title to John Ruiz in a unanimous decision.
And sadly, he actually gets knocked down in this fight, which one of the big attributes that Holyfield had always been pointed to for was an incredible chin, being able to take the best from guys like Bo and big, strong heavyweights, Foreman. And in this instance, he was knocked down by a guy who is not a tremendous heavyweight puncher, and again, considered very far beneath the level of a really elite heavyweight. Because again, with John, the only ranked heavyweight that we had seen him fight was David Tua, and David Tua blew him away in 16 seconds. So we have a lot of just things where we see a real slide in Evander more so than a real skill level or impression from John Ruiz. And I remember just Holyfield in this fight, and I did not rewatch this fight because it's a very bad fight. But I remember watching this live and being like, I can't understand how Holyfield cannot get his footing. They were putting tape on the bottom of his shoes. It was a whole thing, and I remember just being so dissatisfied watching this fight.
Well, we'll do it a third time. Evander Holyfield and the never-ending feuds he has with fighters and multiple fights. This one goes to a draw on December 15, 2001 for the WBA heavyweight title.
And this is a fight where if you think Ruiz got the raw end of the deal in the first one, Holyfield absolutely got the raw deal in this one, because he not only, to me, won at least 8 rounds of this fight, but he also scored a knockdown again on Ruiz. He hit him with a left hook that took him off of his feet and put him on his all fours. That's a knockdown. And he didn't even get credit for that. And had he gotten credit for that, he wins the heavyweight championship for a heavyweight championship, I should say, for a 5th time. But ultimately, it wasn't meant to be. And it is what it is.
One more note about John Ruiz before we shut the book on him. And we close up shop on Evander Holyfield, our man of the hour. John Ruiz will fight on March 1st, 2003. He'll fight Roy Jones Jr., who was just in an exhibition with Mike Tyson, who at the time was the ring light heavyweight champion, and he will lose the WBA heavyweight title to Roy Jones Jr., who will, I think, immediately vacate, if I remember correctly.
Not immediately. He sat on it for a little while.
Okay. He never defends it, though.
No.
Right. So that made Roy Jones Jr. a multiple weight class champion and one of the heavyweight champions.
One of the if you look at history, he at that point in time is only the second man in history to win championships at both middleweight and heavyweight, and the first to do it in 80 years at that point in time.
Any idea as to why Roy Jones Jr. didn't bother defending the heavyweight title?
There was no future for him as a heavyweight. There was a reason why, of any of the heavyweight champions available, he picked John Ruiz to fight against. It was never going to be a big, long future for Roy there, but he had a historic goal to accomplish, did it. But were people really going to watch to see Roy Jones fight Lennox Lewis? The result of that was never going to be in doubt.
John Ruiz will win an interim WBA heavyweight title, for what that's worth, against Hasim Rahman on December 13, 2003 at the Boardwalk Hall in Atlantic City.
No, let's do this with John Ruiz. Don't go through his career. Nobody wants to hear about that. John Ruiz was a very unfan-friendly champion. He had a boring style. He was more often than not favored by officials because he was a Don King fighter who also happened to be of Latino descent that King tried to sell to people, where it was one of those things where there had never been a Latino heavyweight champion. Now King's got one to sell to people. It's a big marketing thing. And we both kind of understood that it's a marketing ploy, and he got the benefit of the doubt from referees constantly. There was a fight with Kirk Johnson where Ruiz threw just as many low blows as Johnson, never penalized. Johnson, meanwhile, gets penalized and disqualified. He got the benefit of decisions against guys like Andrew Gallardo, where he very clearly lost that fight but got the decision. He really was a protected media hype, or not even media hype, because the media hated him too. It was just a Don King collusion control issue where he took a guy with some skill, because Ruiz had a good jab, threw a good right hand, and could take a decent punch, but he really wasn't a very good heavyweight. He was a guy in a position where he was kept there for a reason, and I don't mean to put the guy down, because John Ruiz is a very nice guy who really, has never done anything to me personally and was very nice when I interacted with him. But he's a bad blight on the heavyweight division for a period of time, holding a paper championship while the real heavyweight championship was being contested elsewhere. And it's just not a good thing to revisit. Eventually he finally lost it to Nikolai Valuev and was kind of taken out of the title picture completely when David Haye knocked him out with rabid punches, and it is what it is. But we don't miss John Ruiz. He's a nice guy. I hope he's doing well in retirement, but he was a bad time for heavyweight boxing.
To officially put the exclamation mark on this, you just mentioned the David Haye fight. That's his last fight on record for the WBA heavyweight title, and yes, David Haye got a TKO in the 9th round, and that is the end of John Ruiz from that point forward. All right, so back to Evander Holyfield. Evander Holyfield will fight for the vacant IBF title. Stop me if you think you've heard that one before. But this time against Chris Burton, he'll lose a unanimous decision on December 14, 2002 at the Boardwalk Hall. He'll try for another title, the NABC heavyweight title, at Madison Square Garden against Larry Donald, and lose yet another decision. Unanimous, that's what I was looking for. Oof.
And that one is notable in that was part of a Don King promotion of a heavyweight night of fights at Madison Square Garden. Now, Larry Donald is a guy who was a known heavyweight through the majority of the 90s and early 2000s, but again, a guy not seen as elite. Larry Donald wasn't a puncher. He was always seen as an opponent, and Holyfield lost nearly every round of this fight to Larry Donald in a fight where everybody watching, my family was watching this fight at the time, and we were all like, I'm worried about Evander now, because even if his skills are diminishing, this is not a guy who should be giving him these kinds of problems. And the New York State Athletic Commission happened to feel the same way because they suspended his license on the precipice of diminishing skills.
Well, that would send him overseas, and he will fight for the WBO heavyweight title on October 13th, 2007 in Moscow against Sultan
Ibragimov.
That's the one. And he'll lose that one, too, by unanimous decision. But he keeps trying. And in Zurich, Switzerland, he fights for the WBA heavyweight title again, and this time loses to Nikolai Valuev in a fight most people thought he won. This was a majority decision on December 28th, 2008. But all is not lost for Evander Holyfield. He'll win a vacant... Boy, if you thought some of these other titles we talked about were worthless... Pat, the WBF, is this even still a thing?
Possibly, but whenever I hear those initials, I think to a quote in Bert Sugar's old magazine Fight Game by Greg Haugen, when after a fight he found out he won a version of a WBF title, he said, "What does that stand for? World Butt Fucking Federation?"
Perfect. Well, he wins the WBF title, not the World Bodybuilding Federation, by the way. This is against Francis Botha.
No, but we'll get to Ico Pro.
He'll get a TKO in the 8th round, such as that is. He'll then go on to have a no contest against Sherman Williams. Holyfield was cut from an accidental head clash, and this was in West Virginia, where all good boxers' careers go to die. And finally, he will end his career at 44, 1-0-2. 57 fights as a pro against Brian Nielsen, where he'll get a 10th round TKO in Denmark. There will be no titles on the line this time. After the Nielsen fight, Holyfield attempted to land a shot at the world heavyweight title, all the belts held by the Klitschko brothers at that time. However, after more than
he had a real hankering to recreate Rocky IV's opening fight.
However, after more than a year of trying to land this fight, Yahoo News reported his intentions to retire in 2012, with Holyfield stating, "The game's been good to me, and I hope I've been good to the game. I'm 50 years old on Friday, and I've pretty much did everything that I wanted to do in boxing." Later that same month, however, Holyfield seemed to change his mind, saying that he still considers himself a serious contender. Sure. Unable to secure a title shot, his career went into limbo for several months. However, in June of 2014, after not fighting in over 3 years, Holyfield announced his final retirement. However, and before I get into what else this guy did outside of boxing, so, Pat, 50 words or less, Tyson Roy Jones Jr., go.
Wait, what?
You saw the Tyson fight with Roy Jones Jr., and I am going somewhere with this. I just wanted to get your opinion on it.
They looked every bit their age, and I have no desire to see it again.
Great.
Because Evander
Holyfield wants a third fight with Tyson. Because everybody is now coming out of the woodwork to get a piece of that exhibition, pay-per-view. Boxing is in this weird state of we don't have any stars, and what we do have won't fight each other situation. So
yeah, things we don't need to see.
Yeah. No desire to see Evander Holyfield Tyson 3?
None, because Holyfield will kill him, and we don't care.
All right. But yes, Evander Holyfield is calling out Mike Tyson. I think Shannon Briggs threw his name out there.
Oh, yeah. Shannon Briggs throws his name out everywhere.
Yep. All the Lennox Lewis. I think somebody suggested Antonio Tarver, Roy Jones. Lewis
is calling out Riddick Bowe.
Yeah, Lewis is calling out Riddick Bowe. Oh my God. Legends League. Can you dig it, Pat? No, you can't. You know you can't.
No, I cannot.
All right, let's finish this up. So Evander Holyfield, he would go on to do other things outside of boxing. In 1992, Holyfield was already a household name, endorsing multiple products on television such as Coca-Cola and Diet Coke. He also had a video game released for the Sega Genesis and Sega Game Gear.
Evander Holyfield's Real Deal Boxing. What a game.
Goddamn right. Go ahead.
Oh, man. My introduction to Evander Holyfield Beyond TV was playing that video game and just thinking he was the tits because he had every stat maxed out in that game.
Yes, indeed. In 1996, Holyfield was given the opportunity to carry the Olympic torch when it was on its way to his hometown of Atlanta for that year's Olympics. October 4th, he was married to Dr. Janice Itzen, whom he had one child. On September 22nd, 2007, Holyfield released the Real Deal Grill, like you do, cooking appliance via TV infomercials. The Real Deal Grill is who cares? All right.
George Foreman.
Yeah. So he also made a bunch of celebrity appearances. Holyfield's popularity led to numerous television appearances for the boxer. His first television show was on the Christmas special of The Fresh Prince of Bel-Air in 1990, where he played himself. Holyfield had minor roles in 3 movies during the 90s. Summer of Sam, what a great movie that is. Necessary Roughness, and Blood Salvage, which he also produced. He made guest appearances on Nickelodeon's Nickelodeon Guts during its 3rd season in 94. He appeared once in an episode of the children's animated series Phineas and Ferb. In the episode, he is an animated character, but the producers wanted to make the most of Holyfield's ear, so his animated character was only given half an ear. Perfect. In 2005, Holyfield came in 5th place on ABC's Dancing with the Stars with his partner Aditya Slawinska. Perfect. He also made an appearance on the original BBC Strictly Come Dancing Champion of Champions Showdown, which featured the final 4 teams from the 2005 edition of the British series, plus 2 celebrities from spin-off versions paired with British professional dancers, one featuring Holyfield paired with Karen Hardy, and Rachel Hunter paired with Brendan Cole. And here's one you might remember, Pat. On August 13, 2007, Holyfield was confirmed to participate in a boxing match at WWE's Saturday Night's Main Event against Matt Hardy. He replaced Montel Vontavious Porter, MVP, Ballin', who had to pull out after being legitimately diagnosed with a heart condition that was not part of a storyline. Anything?
I remember they let Matt wear headgear, and I don't remember what the purpose of, because he was the good guy. And why would you put him in a situation where an over-the-hill, used-up Evander Holyfield still beats him up?
Vince. Holyfield appeared as himself in the 2011 remake of Arthur. January 3rd, 2014, he became the 12th housemate to enter the 13th series of Celebrity Big Brother in the UK. And on January 6, 2014, he was reprimanded by the show after saying in a conversation with another housemate that gayness is abnormal and can be fixed. Moving on! On January 10th, 2014, he became the first housemate to be evicted. In May of 2016, Holyfield entered the Argentine dancing reality show. I'm seeing a pattern here. Bailando in 2016. Holyfield is ranked number 77 on the Rings list of 100 greatest punchers of all time, and in 2002 named him the 22nd greatest fighter of the past 80 years. He currently ranks number 9 in Boxrec's ranking of the greatest pound-for-pound boxers of all time. Boxing Scene also ranked him the greatest cruiserweight of all time. Pat, is he in the Hall of Fame, the Boxing Hall of Fame?
Yes. He's absolutely a first ballot Hall of Famer. And again, not just for what he accomplished as a heavyweight, which is incredible, but people often tend to forget he's arguably the greatest cruiserweight fighter that there's ever been, having unified that division, which nobody else before him did, and only one man since has done, and that was only done as of last year.
So what do you think? I mean, you know, we talked about how Tyson saved heavyweight boxing, but Tyson flames out because of his psychological and personal problems, and there's Evander Holyfield, while his record is spotty and he loses to Riddick Bowe and Michael Moore and John Ruiz, he's there to sort of pick up the torch from Mike Tyson and carry us through this era of boxing, keep it interesting, keep it fun. And, you know, again, Holyfield has a very storied career. I'll
make this kind of comparison, since you're going in this era kind of thing. If Mike Tyson is Hulk Hogan, Evander Holyfield is Bret Hart.
Yes, sir.
There's an over-the-top persona that's very media-friendly and very much attention-catching and great for, you know, advertising and things of that nature. But the in-ring product is not always the desired result, because it's either the same old stuff or it's something that was completely
not what people wanted to see in a passing of the torch kind of way. Mike Tyson, the persona and everything, and always constantly just coming out with a big knockout, walking away, and that's that. Hogan come in, slay the monster, big persona, walk out, that's that. One loses in a passing of the torch to the Ultimate Warrior that ultimately doesn't pan out and doesn't do well for the company and industry going forward. One loses by just not doing what he should do against Buster Douglas, and that loses attention because Buster doesn't immediately pick up that. And they're looking for the next guy who can carry the torch and be the guy. And it was almost as if Holyfield constantly put on great performances against whoever he was in there with. And a lot of times he was the smaller guy having to slay a monster like a Riddick Bowe. And much the same way Bret Hart wasn't an over-the-top media personality, but he was just a consistently very good performer in what product and content you got in the actual action, that he was left to carry this torch for a company in ruins. And in many ways, boxing as a sport in the 90s, a sport looking for an identity when it lost its face in Mike Tyson, and not in the most glamorous of ways, the same with the rape situation, the same way, the WWF faced the sex and steroid scandal, and you needed someone to kind of have some sort of identity of integrity and constant entertainment value, and that's what Holyfield provided.
So Holyfield is part of a half a dozen or so guys that made up the 90s and 2000s in heavyweight boxing. And we will continue that story on our next podcast with one of those people who started in the golden age of boxing and came back in what I would say is the second golden age of heavyweight boxing.
No, we've been very kind to Commander Vander, but there's one thing we do kind of have to talk about, but we didn't get to yet.
Oh, you're right. Okay, I will take a step back. Pat, Evander Holyfield, a picture of class and dignity, but not an angel. And why is that?
Well, I'm going to leave the infidelity stuff out. I don't think that's really anything to do with his boxing career, that he, had a bunch of kids with a bunch of different women, but whatever. He didn't do commercials for condoms, so I'm not going to get on him for that. But there's been one kind of cloud that always loomed over the career of Evander Holyfield, and that involves performance-enhancing drugs. Holyfield has been a guy who, throughout a lot of his career by opponents and investigations, was accused of using performance-enhancing drugs. In the early days, they were just kind of blanketly labeled steroids. But, as it's come to be known later on, there are people who have accused him of using HGH, human growth hormone. He was linked to Applied Pharmacy, which was a supplier of illegal HGH and anabolic steroids for the time, and he's kind of been under a cloud for that for a lot of reasons. In part because his build from going from cruiserweight to heavyweight involved gaining a lot of upper body mass, and not necessarily just mass, but very well-toned, chiseled mass. Holyfield's physique has always been one that people have admired and been so impressed by, and he did grow in many respects much larger as a heavyweight than he did on his frame as a cruiserweight. His neck was noticeably larger, his chest, his shoulders. And yes, that does involve hard work and a lot of time in the gym. And, he incorporated a lot more weightlifting than we see most fighters do. But he also had other instances that are consistent with the use of anabolics, among them very rapid out-of-nowhere hair loss, the inability to sustain high-activity energy bursts for long periods of time, and constantly getting tired towards the end of fights, which is ironic because we talk about his conditioning program prior to fighting Buster Douglas, which was made to have him really be able to excel at these levels and push energy forward, and we talk about him surging and coming back against Riddick Bowe, that these effects after a little while were gone. And a lot of the thought is that he at some point probably used anabolics of some kind that were illegal since 1989 to add muscle mass and add strength, but what they did was take away from his endurance and his ability and caused repeated muscle tears to his right side, which he really at a certain point stopped using effectively and became a one-armed fighter. In his loss to James Toney, he said, I tore my rotator cuff, and in his points loss to Chris Bird for challenging for the vacant IBF title, he'd said, I had a problem with my right shoulder. And a lot of the issues Evander had are consistent with guys who use steroids. Again, he was, linked to Applied Pharmacy, and even though his name wasn't under their documents, they did have somebody with the name Evan Fields who had the same address as his address, and when they called the phone number, allegedly he answered. And while we may not have ever had concrete proof that he was absolutely using performance enhancers, I do believe he used them. I do believe that he used them during a downtime in his career. I link him to probably using those after his first loss to Riddick Bowe, to be quite honest, because the main reasons he may have thought he lost to Bowe were size and strength. And when he worked so hard to put on muscle mass and get stronger to compete with heavyweights, and you lose based on those things, how do you do that? You compensate with more. But at the same time, knowing that he trained with somebody like a Lee Haney, who was from the bodybuilding world in the 80s where steroid use ran rampant, it's not out of the question to believe he started using them as early as then. So, I think that does cast a little bit of a cloud over Holyfield's career, and it's unfortunate because of what a career it was.
Thank you, Pat. So, as I was saying earlier, Evander Holyfield's competing in what I like to think is the second golden age of heavyweight boxing, and there was between fracturing titles and the amount of guys competing and winning titles, there's a lot going on, and it's, as I've said before, I think I tried to draw a chart of where the titles went into whom, and it looked like a really complex football play. It's just all over the place. And one of those guys that would add to the confusion, who competed in both golden ages, of course, he fought Muhammad Ali and Joe Frazier, and then he would take a 10-year hiatus and come back and compete in this second age, George Foreman, who will contest for WBO titles and WBA and IBF, and he will have an interesting second wave as a boxer, and we will talk all about that in our next podcast here. So Chapter 14, George Foreman, is next, and that'll take place January 13th, assuming Pat can make that date, or we'll do it on
which is also the birth month of George Foreman.
Oh, how about that? It's kismet. In the meantime, here's what we got going on in the wonderful world of the Radulich and Broadcasting Network. Myself and Ronnie Adams spent over 2 hours last night talking about the NBC sitcom Community, which lasted for 6 seasons and not yet a movie.
Oh, good Lord.
Myself and Jesse Starcher reviewed the new Public Enemy album on the Metal Hammer of Doom, like you do.
Is Flavor Flav on it?
Yeah, he is. All 60 years old of him. And myself, Alexis Haina, and Chris Sheehan talked about the recent 3-issue limited series Batman 3 Jokers, which came out of Justice League's The Dark Side War. So that's all in the archives for you to enjoy. Next week is Christmas. We have a lot of Christmas stuff lined up for you, and some other things as well. We've got on source material, myself and Chris Sheehan will be looking at a wordless comic book, only pictures, because it's the Ultimate Warrior Christmas special. Ultimate Warrior had his own comic book.
Oh, yeah, Santa in Bondage.
That's right. Ultimate Warrior had his own comic book for a cup of coffee, and he, at the end of that series, all 4 issues of it, he also did a Christmas special. It's fantastic. I can't wait to describe in vascular detail the Ultimate Warrior Christmas special.
Get ready for Distrucity, everybody.
Yes. We'll take a break from Christmas things and talk about Monster Hunter with Mila Jovovich, and we'll review WWE TLC on the 22nd. And then our last Metal Hammer of Doom album review for the year, we are looking at Majestica, A Christmas Carol. And then that's going to probably be it, unless we end up doing the AEW show. I have to talk to Chris Bailey. I don't know yet. You don't watch the AEW, do you?
Very, very little.
Jim Cornette described Kenny Omega as a cantering horse, and I haven't stopped laughing about that since he said it. I just needed to share that with you.
That's more of a compliment than he deserves.
Indeed. Pat, other than recording with me, and we've got some stuff lined up for 2021 that's very exciting regarding boxing and wrestling, and we'll talk about that when it draws a little bit closer. But are you stepping out? Are you podcasting with anyone else? You got any projects in the works?
No.
Terrific. All right, folks, thank you for joining us on Chapter 13 of the History of Boxing, featuring Evander Holyfield. Until next time, be well, be safe, and behave.